All right, 1 second here. All right, 1 second. All right. All right, 1 second. Let's do another thing. I'm just gonna start anyway. All right, one. All right, so welcome to this Q&A. Again, sorry for the delay, a little bit of technical issues here. Nonetheless, want to welcome everyone. I want to welcome everyone to this Q&A. Question came in. Question came in earlier, and that is, someone wants to convert, right? It's really a question about, really a question. So the question was, someone wants to convert, and the issue is they're dating a Jew, right? Non-Jew dating a Jew. So the issue is, someone told me, or they asked if they're dating, they heard if they're dating a non-Jew, right? Let's say someone's dating a non-Jew, is that going to be a problem for Beis Din? So in general, that is probably going to be a problem. And if they're living together, it's a major red flag, because a person's not allowed to convert for the sake of any ulterior motive, right? No ulterior motive is permissible, is permissible to convert, right? Meaning, I basically said to this person that bottom line is going to be that the non-Jew is going to have to convince the Beis Din beyond the shadow of a doubt that regardless of what happens to this Jew, they're going to convert either way, right? That is going to be the case, right? In other words, they're going to have to convince the Beis Din that this is the case, that they were already converting before, right? Regardless of what may or may not happen to this Jew, they're going to convert anyway, right? So the point is there are no ulterior motives, right? Ulterior motives would be would be forbidden, right? Totally would be would totally be forbidden. So it looks bad, right? Essentially it looks bad if a person would say they're going to convert and there's only one thing they're not going to do, right? In other words, they'll do everything, but they're not going to keep kosher. They'll do everything, but like a woman may say, I'm not going to cover my hair, right? If she's married or something, right? It's all or nothing. In other words, conversion is going to be either you're going to keep it all or don't bother, right? That's really going to be, right? That is really going to be the bottom line, right? In other words, a person's going to convert. There are no things that you're not going to do. In other words, it might be hard for a person to do. Okay, right? It might be, someone says, "Well, it's hard to cover my hair." Okay, that doesn't mean they're not going to do it, right? But if they say, no certain term, this is something I'm not going to do, i.e., kashrus, right? This is something I'm not going to do, and I would never do. Well, it doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter. It could be the most stringent thing. It could be the most lenient thing. Whatever it is. Yeah, it's all or nothing. Bottom line. So if a person potentially is going to convert for any ulterior motive, that's forbidden, right? That's forbidden. So now, in this case, I know of a case. Let's just say a person was dating somebody. They weren't living together. At this point, they were dating somebody, and the Beis Din went out of their way to, basically that they shouldn't speak. They shouldn't have any contact, etc. And eventually the person converted. I think they ended up marrying this person, this Jew. In either case, they left a bad taste in their mouth. Now, that I can understand. But at the same time, Beis Din has to ascertain 100% if a person is going to convert, right? And they're dating a Jew, or they're interested in dating a Jew, or whatever the case is. Let's say they're dating a Jew, make it easy. It's a major, major red flag. Because one of the things a rabbinical court is going to ask is marital status. If you're married, right, or if you're dating. Do you have a significant other? That is the question they're going to ask. Yeah, something I always ask also. But again, both have to be on the same page. And if one is not on, if that person is not on the same page, then you have one or two choices. Either you don't date, you don't end up marrying this person, or you don't convert, right? Or if a person would be married, it's a little bit easier. Basically, will cut you more slack. Let's say a Jew or a non-Jew is married to a Jew. It's not the non-Jew's fault, it's the Jew's fault. But in either case, there's more room, more room to work with. But if this person says, and I've heard this a number of times, if they're going to say, well, this is something, I'm going to do no matter what, and either their spouse or significant other is not interested, then they have one or two choices. Either they don't date, they get divorced, or if they're married, right, or they don't convert. Now, in general, I've spoken about this before, I'll just mention in passing that I would never tell someone to do that. Now, again, I understand, someone will say it's the most important thing I'll ever do, blah, blah, blah. If there's nothing really wrong with the marriage, I mean, no marriage is perfect, but if a person wouldn't consider getting divorced anyway, then I'm certainly not going to really want to tell them to do it, right? I certainly don't think it's healthy. And even though, converting is a nice thing and, it's an important thing, I wouldn't dissolve marriage because of it. Certainly wouldn't tell people to do it. All right. Now, someone says, I'm going to do it anyway, regardless. You're not going to listen and take my advice. Fine. So, it's your choice. Right. But again, I don't think it's so healthy. And I don't know other people that would tell someone to do that unless there are already issues. Now, some people I dealt with, there are already issues. They're already going down that path anyway. So, okay. So if that's the case, that's a different story, right? But both have to be on the same page, right? Certainly both have to be, be on the same page. Now, there are people that would argue, what's the problem? They want to convert, so I won't get in the way, right? The Jew says I won't get in the way, okay, or even a non-Jew. Let's say they're married to a non-Jew, even better. And the non-Jewish spouse, and one of the spouses doesn't want to convert. Okay, they don't have to convert, right? But they say, I'll back them. I'll back them 100%. I won't interfere. Okay. But at the end of the day, no Orthodox rabbinical court is going to convert you. Probably conservative may not either. I'm not sure. I'm not sure at this stage. But the reason is very simple. So if a person's keeping Torah mitzvahs, and they're a Jew, they can't be married to a non-Jew. That's pretty simple, right? That's one of the worst things a person can do is for a Jew to marry a non-Jew. Okay, so they have to make a choice over here, right? They'll have to make a choice. In that case, rabbinical court will never convert them, and it doesn't make sense that they should, right? And again, I've heard the argument. I think it's a weak argument, extremely weak argument, where some people say, you know what? It's not the end of the world, right? I'll back them. I won't interfere. But then you have a non-Jew running around who knows what, cautious wise is, other things. So a non-Jew, I guess it's not their fault. They don't have to keep Shabbos. They don't have to keep anything over here. Yeah, but the Jew is liable. The Jew is liable. And if they're married, every time they're intimate, it's a total prohibition. For the Jew, it's not a problem for the non-Jew. It's a problem for the Jew. Right? It's not even, I wouldn't even say it's putting a stumbling block because you don't have something forbidden, a transgression for a non-Jew putting a stumbling block in front of someone. It's only works by a Jew, it doesn't work by a non-Jew. But in either case, if someone says, I'll do whatever it takes to convert, even at the point where, I lose my spouse and potentially kids or who knows what, it's their choice, right? They're making a choice. Would I tell somebody to do it? No. So I know of a story. I don't know any of the details, but somebody put up a post a while ago, whatever, a long time ago. They put up a post and they're saying they became an Orthodox Jew. Very good. They're happy they became an Orthodox Jew. Okay. right? They're happy they did it, but they lost their spouse in the process, right? That's what they said. That's what they said on themselves. Now again, they said they're happy what they did. They're happy with the end result, right? They are a member of the tribe. Okay. Very good, right? But they said they paid a price. They paid a price. Now they seemingly have regret. But they're not going back. They're not going back. Non-Jews didn't want to convert. They don't have to convert. Now, at this point, this person took on Torah mitzvahs. Happy they took on Torah mitzvahs. Now, what are they going to do? I mean, they could choose to say, okay, I'm not going to keep Torah mitzvahs anymore. I'll go back to that spouse, right? We'll get back together. Yeah, it's a big problem because they're Jewish. Even if they renounce their Judaism. Even if they convert to another religion. They go back and become a Christian or a Buddhist. Yeah. I still can't sell my chametz to them. They have the status of a Jew. Maybe they're Messianic, they're Christian, they're whatever. Okay. But no matter what, if a Jew converts to another religion, they're still a Jew. So in this case, once they convert, it's a proper rabbinical court. Yeah. 2 months later, 5 months later, a year later, they don't want any part of it anymore. They're still a Jew. Why? Because the assumption is, again, unless there are issues at the very beginning, they weren't keeping Torah mitzvahs, that I could hear. That is the problem with the conversion. But if the conversion's valid, and they decide to go off, they decide to go off, they're still a Jew. Right? I can't lend them money with with interest, and I can't use them as a Shabbos goy, and all these things. Right? They're a Jew. I can't sell chametz to them. They're a full-fledged Jew. If they didn't keep Torah mitzvah at the very beginning, that's a different issue. Then it would seem that the conversion was not valid. It could be they duped the Beis Din. Yeah, could very well be. They duped them. Or they, whatever. Beis Din thought one thing and, they fooled them. Okay. But that shows beyond the shadow of a doubt, they never had intention to keep Torah. So that's a different issue. That calls the whole conversion into question. But if the conversion was valid, it doesn't matter what happens a year later, 5 months later. If they were keeping Torah mitzvahs and they go off, the conversion was good, then they still have the status of a Jew. That doesn't change. And when they die, they're going to get judged as a Jew. Right? Regardless if they convert to a different religion, doesn't do anything. Right? Someone once told me, what do you call it? You pour water over them, to be a Christian. So, what that means? It means they got wet. That's all it means. Doesn't change anything. Right? In other words, once they're a Jew, they're a Jew. Regardless of what they do. They can lose their status in different ways. They can repent to get it back, right? If they don't believe in the 13 principles of faith, right, of Maimonides, a Jew says they don't believe in resurrection of the dead. God forbid. Or they don't believe in coming to the Messiah. Or they don't believe in, in reward and punishment. Okay. Right? These things are crucial to being a Jew. So that would take them, regardless of why they don't believe in it, it doesn't really matter how much they know or they don't know, and even if they're a potato farmer in Idaho. No offense, anyone's a potato farmer grew up in Idaho. Doesn't matter what the reason is. Right? They can repent. They can come back. Right? If they properly repent, good. If they don't, they lose their status. Right? What we look at them where they're holding right now. Right? So, you think secular Jew doesn't keep Shabbos. Yeah, let's say they don't keep Shabbos. They desecrate Shabbos in public. Okay. Let's say they desecrate Shabbos in public. So right now they have a certain status. Now that doesn't mean it stays that way forever. Right? We're not Hindus over here. You're not stuck, so to speak. What can happen is they get it back. How do you get it back? You repent. You go through the proper channels of repentance. Right? If you go through the proper channels of repentance, you get it back. If not, okay. But again, we're looking at that status right now. Right? We are looking at that status right now. And that status tells me If they desecrate Shabbos in public, they are in trouble. And there are certain ramifications. Yeah, again, for certain things, there'll be cut some slack a little bit. For other things, we don't care why they're doing it. We don't care if they don't have knowledge. It doesn't matter. We don't care if they, they want to be Karaites. They don't want to believe in oral law. They don't want to keep what the rabbis tell them. We don't care why. We don't care what their philosophy is. All right, let's say this is what they do. Even if they don't have knowledge, they're in trouble. Now, for certain things, again, we'll look at it like they didn't know what they were doing. So they are going to get punished. I don't think there's any question. They won't get punished as severely, but it depends on what it is. They does a great job. Why should they not have serious punishment? Yeah, because they don't repent. So that's the worst of all transgressions. So to speak. But they certainly have to know, it's wrong and whatever. Doesn't matter what they think, right? This is the point, right? We don't care what their philosophical outlook is. People may say, "Wow, this was written for an agricultural society." We don't live in an agricultural society today, right? You tell me, yeah, there are people who live on farms and whatever. Okay, we're not living in an agricultural society. You say, "Oh, it doesn't apply," right? The laws of the Torah forever. They don't change. Now, certain things we can't do anymore because of our own sins, right? But whenever, the Torah says this is forever, I always make this point, and that is forever means forever. You're going to give me Webster's fifth definition, only meant that generation. It says forever. Forever means it doesn't change. Now we have to understand how it applies, right? That we've spoken about, and in other classes, how these things apply and what it means. We don't have definitions, right? I spoke about that before. We don't have definitions according to the Torah, right? Torah says don't steal in a number of places. How much are you liable for? A penny? 10 cents? $1? Torah doesn't tell me. Torah doesn't give me any definitions, right? So you need definitions. Doesn't mean they're changing the Torah. They're telling you what it means, right? You need, a running commentary. If you don't have a running commentary, you will not do anything. Anything, right? The Torah says can't speak badly against others. Well, what does that mean? What if it's true? What if everybody knows? I'm just learning this today. Right? Chofetz Chaim says the law of the Lashon Hara, and if it's true, there are certain conditions, we have to meet certain conditions in order to repeat it, even if everybody knows it. This is why non-Jews are not obligated to the laws of Lashon Hara, because that doesn't make any sense, logically. Right? According to our logic. Why not? Because it's true. Let's say it's verified. Right? 100% it's verified. Whatever the details are irrelevant. It's verified it's true. Okay. So if it's verified it's true, and everybody knows it, it's all over the newspapers. I don't know if people read them anymore. Or it's all over the internet, either way. Everybody knows it. What do you mean I can't repeat it? What do you mean I can only repeat it in certain, in certain context? Doesn't make any sense. Everybody knows it. Something that's well known. Maybe you find someone in Iceland, I don't know, someone on the North Pole, they didn't know this. Well, guess what? That's probably not true, right? Because, they probably also, connect to social media and who knows what. Everybody, it's all around the world. Everyone can tap in. So how can it not be? You say, well, people in the Amazon. Okay. Yeah. So some people in the Amazon, they're not technologically savvy. Okay. Doesn't matter. The rest of the world knows. Right? If it's something that's known, and let's say better, it's true. If it's true, why couldn't I repeat it? What's the problem repeating it? What do I, even if you want to say, well, why do I need conditions? Right? We'll make it very simple. Just tell me I can repeat it. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. So what's the problem? That's why you need definitions here. The Torah is a law book, as we said before. It's a law book. Do this, don't do that, do this, whatever it is. But it doesn't tell you how. It doesn't tell you how to do these things. Anyone, have any idea what a nice smelling fruit is? On Sukkot? You say, of course, it's an etrog, a citron, the lemon on steroids. Anyone going to think that's what it was? You think it's a quince, someone thinks it's a pomegranate, someone thinks it's a pear, peach, plum, whatever. But if you don't get it right, you don't fulfill your obligations. How do you know what it is? How do you know what it is? So you need oral law, right? That's the point. Right? That's the point. You can't just make it up as you go along. There are laws. There are obligations. Right? So when a person denies it, it doesn't matter why. Right? They say it doesn't fit my world outlook. Okay, do you really think we care what you think? Does anyone care what I think? Nobody cares what I think. Nobody cares what any other rabbis think. And what does the Torah say? What am I supposed to do? What am I obligated to do? Not a free for all. Not a hefker welt. It's not an ownerless world, right? Just as a side point. As a side point, this is the reason. This is the reason when kids they start to learn Gemara, right? At the age of usually 10 or 11. What's the first thing they learn? They learn the second chapter of Bava Metzia. What's the second chapter of Bava Metzia speak about? Lost objects, right? And you might have to put up signs if you find something, right? And if it's question is about returning things. Okay, returning things that seemingly are lost. Lost objects, right? So obvious question: why they learn that first? They won't, as Gemara goes, it's certainly a lot easier, explaining these concepts than other things. Okay, because the mind's not so well developed. Okay, but the reason is to show that the world is not ownerless, and that we don't believe in finders keepers. Now it depends, right? A person found $5 bill, a quarter, whatever, on the street. Can they pick it up? They can pick it up, right? Why are they allowed to pick it up? Because someone must have dropped it. Yeah, but if they dropped it, most likely they already gave up hope of trying to find it, right? And there's no sign either. It's just, if there were a stack of bills and that was put, let's say, in a lunch bag and that was put in a specific place and left there, yeah, that's a different issue. Right, the place would be, a certain person would have to identify the place and the amount. So a person would have to put up a sign, right, around there and say, found sum of money. You lost something. Here's a number code. But they have to give information on what the amount was, where it was. They'd have to give signs. They can't just say, "Oh, I lost." I lost a lot of money, and that where'd you find it? Well, they're not going to tell you. You have to give details. I'm just going to hand over the money here, or whatever it is. But in that case, it was left in a specific place, right? They dropped it there, right? So that's a different issue. It wasn't just bills, stray bills here and there, right, or whatever. So whatever. There are details. There are details over here, right? That criteria has to be met in order to get the object back. Very good. Now, some things not worth the time to do, so you may not have an obligation to do it. Some things you would take, and if no one claims it, you put up signs or whatever. So you may have to hold on to it, for the rest of your life, until Elijah the prophet comes, and if not, then you have to pass it down, right? Otherwise, you may not be allowed to take it. Right? May not be allowed to take it. Okay. Right? But there are details, right? So you're teaching kids from a very young age, right? You're teaching them from a very young age that guess what? That the world's not ownerless. That the world have obligations, right? And those obligations tell me I can't just take whatever I want if I see it. If I see it, let's say, on the street, some things I can. What if, give one example. What if you saw, somebody left on the ground. They left, let's say, a whole bunch of American quarters, but they put it in a certain form, right? They put it like in a pyramid or something like that. So you can't say, well, that's random, right? If they were spread out, different thing, that's a different issue. But if it's put in a certain, in a certain, I don't know, like a pyramid or something like that, they put two here, like a tripod, right? Put two here, one in the middle, two here, one in the middle. Okay, that means that would be a sign somebody left it there. And they did it in a specific way. Yeah, so that's a different issue. So that I would have to put up a sign. Right? Then I would have to put up a sign. But there are certain things, again, without going into detail, but there are certain things that wouldn't be, worth your time even to do it. Right? So, you wouldn't have to. But there's a Torah prohibition, keep in mind. If you would have an obligation, let's say, to put up signs in this case, and you just walk by it, not that you didn't see it, you walk by it, and you don't want to have anything to do with it. It's a Torah prohibition. A Torah prohibition can have absolute obligation to put up a sign. All things being equal, right? It was put in a certain place. It certainly worth something, and it certainly looked like someone dropped it there or left it there and they just forgot it or whatever. Okay, but if you look the other way, you don't have a good excuse, right? I'll make this very, very simple. You have no excuse over here. So what happens? What happens? Torah prohibition. It's like you took your eyes away from it. That's Torah prohibition. That's Torah prohibition. Yeah. So in that sense, right? In that sense, that's why children learn that first, right? They learn that Gemara first in order to understand the world is just not ownerless, and that the world has all their obligations. We have obligations, not just sometimes it's a question of finders keepers. Depends what it is, right? But in general, right? In general, I got responsibility, right? That's how it comes out. That's how it comes out according to that. Yeah, let me take some questions now. Once a Jew, never anything else. Right. Someone asking, a non-Jewish rabbi exists. Can pork be kosher? You're gonna say my kesher. What's the connection? A pig, right, is one of the few animals, right? What makes a kosher animal, right? Just point this out. What makes a kosher animal? Choose its cut, right? It has split hooves. So a pig only fulfills one of them, right? A camel fulfills one of them, so like the rabbits fulfill one of them. Okay, what's the point? Is a pig kosher? No. Say in the future, Messiah comes, and it's going to change and be kosher, whatever that means. That we're not talking about that. Right now, is a pig kosher? No. Right? Tomorrow, is it going to be kosher? No. After the Messiah comes, good. We'll have a discussion. Yeah, we'll have a discussion. Right? A non-Jew. Now, what does being a rabbi mean? Now, if we say that a rabbi only means that they teach, could a non-Jew teach? They could teach. Yeah, I was just talking to a very prestigious rabbi here the other day. 2 days ago, I think I was at a wedding, so whatever, waiting for the wedding to start. So I don't know, a conversation came up about I don't know, translations and different things. Oh, we're talking about learning Gemara. And I was saying when I first learned Gemara was before Art Scroll came out. The only translation that came out of the Gemara in English was Sonsino. And the translation was absolutely horrific. They say that the Aramaic was easier to learn. You go online and see what the translation of what Sonsino, how they translate, the Gemara, and just like it's incomprehensible. So this rabbi was telling me when he was learning in England many years ago. So he had a Sonsino. So he actually had a Sonsino, and so they told him in the yeshiva, okay, you can use it on Shabbos. Right, you shouldn't use it, as a whatever, as a translation, even though maybe it make the Gemara a little bit easier, right? So then there was a question. So I said, I had learned how to learn. This is before Sonsino came out. Say a dictionary. What was the dictionary? It was called the Jastro. Right now, he still says he had it. I got rid of mine a while ago, but it's whatever. It's very thorough. This person, what do you call it? Jastro did an unbelievable job. Got to give credit where it's due. He took the roots, the words. I mean, a lot of the words in the Gemara are Aramaic, right? Aramaic and Hebrew. So Aramaic comes from the Hebrew, so it's just different forms, at the end of the words. right? But even if you know Hebrew, even if you know Hebrew, so the words don't necessarily mean the same, certainly in Aramaic, as well. So he spent time like looking these things up, looking these phrases up, and a lot of times he would quote like the exact phrase that you need, right? And he would tell you what it means. Now there are terms, in Gemara, just in general, in the Talmud itself, that are common, common terms, like very common terms. They come up all the time, right? So once you know it, since you see it so many times, right, you're not even going to think twice, about what it means. But then there are like homiletic Gemara's, talk about different stories and different things. You could learn it in 5 minutes or 5 years, as they say, and like. And a lot of these words only used once, and like, trying to understand it's not, it's not very simple, and it's like breaking your teeth sometimes, trying to figure out what's going on, right? But in either case, the issue was, so I'll get to the point in a second, but the issue was that this Jew, he wasn't religious. Some say, he repented before he died, but he was whatever. He was I'm not going to call him a biblical, whatever. He was a scholarly Jew, let's say. He was scholarly. Okay. So he wrote, like, he did an unbelievable amount of work, unbelievable amount of research, no question, right? No question, but he wasn't religious, right? Some say that he repented before he died. I don't know. I don't know if it's true, right, or not, but like people used it. People relied on it, right? Now, there were times which became problematic. This is exactly what the issue is that, or one of the issues, is sometimes he'll bring down, let's say, a certain term, and he'll say the term means like this, right? And he'll say why he thinks it means like that or whatever. And he'll say, well, Rashi explains like this, I think like this. Well, that's kind of a problem, right? None of us are on that level. Like, nobody is on that level. The Vilna Gaon wasn't on that level, right? You want to, if you're alive in his generation or whatever, you can argue on him. If not, you got a problem because previous generation is much greater than us. But that was among some of the issues. But so the question was, at least for this, are you allowed to use it? Could you use it? Right? So once I had a question, one of my kids wanted to sit at the table. I had a choice. I mean, this was like a really, really fat book, right? So I said I could have him sit on that or a phone book. Right now, phone book, you got a problem. Phone book might be muksa because you got advertisements. I don't know. People probably don't use phone books anymore, right? But you have advertisements there, and whatever. Thing itself would be a problem to move. So I had a question: what's better? I can use a phone, but before I had a what do you call it, like a booster seat or something like that. But what's better to use? What's better to use? I mean, this dictionary doesn't have any holiness in it, no question about it. Certainly doesn't, right? So even though it's quoting, Talmudic words and what do you call it, what they mean, it's not a holy book. I could probably take it in the bathroom, probably. Yeah. So the question was, what's better to sit on? This, because it really doesn't have any holiness, right? Or a phone book. Okay. Now, what's my point? That was just a side point. So part of this conversation, so the rabbi asked, he said, you remember the Danby Mishnayos, right? When you had the Mishnah and the commentary on the Mishnah makes up what the Talmud is, right? So the Mishnah is really, let's say, like a commentary on the Torah, right? And all kinds of different tractates talk about talk about blessings, talk about the laws of Passover. You got tractate about Shabbos, you got tractate about marriage, divorce, I mean, whatever. All these different things. So the Mishnah and the Gemara make up what we call the Talmud, right? And there was this guy, Danby, who wrote a translation, not really so much commentary, but a translation of the Mishnah, right? He wrote a translation of the Mishnah, into English. Now, this guy, Danby, was a Catholic priest, right? He was a Catholic priest who made it. He didn't really write a commentary. It wasn't a commentary, but it was a translation. It was a translation because there are words in the Mishnah not as some things not as common. So if a person's first learning, right, it's a good source to use, right? It would be a good source to use. Why? Because it's just a translation, right? Now let's say for argument's sake he knew what he was doing, right? And he knew what the words meant or whatever. Okay, you can have that, right? You can certainly have that, but he was a Christian. He was a Catholic. He was a priest. He was a priest who wrote this, right? So this rabbi asked me. He said he had a copy. I also had a copy at one point, right? I also had a copy. Why? It was like one very, very thick book, right? It wasn't multi volumes, right? Because there's no commentary. He just translated it, but it came in handy. It certainly came in handy. So now the question. Okay, translated it. For argument's sake, let's say translation's good. Could you use it? The priest wrote it. Yeah, so good. That's a good question, right? But everyone will tell you get rid of it. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you got the right translation. And the priest read it. Get rid of it. Yeah, you shouldn't have it. Okay. Now back. So that was just way of introduction. Only took me 15 minutes. Okay, 20 minutes here. Yeah. What's the point? Right? A rabbi's a teacher. Very good. So could you have a non-Jew as a teacher? In theory, that's what they're teaching. Right? But usually definition of a rabbi today is they pass requisite number of exams in certain things. One is, let's say, proficiency in the laws of Shabbos. One of them is proficiency in the laws of kashrus. One is laws of proficiency of family purity laws. Some take exams also in the laws of mourning customs, right, as well. Now, some people, let's say, have ordination in all these things. Some people only have one, or some people have two. Now it means they pass a certain level of proficiency, right, in that topic. Very good. So really what it means is that let's say they pass this exam in proficiency in the laws of Shabbos. Yeah, and then someone asks them a kashrus question. Yeah, they traced up a bowl, spoon. I don't know, what do you call it? A pot or something like that. Yeah. So now, really, would you be allowed to answer? You're not necessarily proficient in it. You don't learn all the laws to the end or who knows what. You didn't get tested on it, right? So really the halacha is unless it's black and white, right? Unless it's black and white or you know what the answer is, and that is the answer, then you could answer. But really, if you have ordination on one thing, you shouldn't answer questions on other things, right? So to speak. Now, today, ordination, I think I've spoken about this before, a while ago. I think it's overrated in many ways. There are some people that have serious world-class knowledge. Doesn't make them, they may not have status of rabbi because they didn't finish, they didn't take any exams or whatever. Doesn't mean they don't have world-class knowledge, right? But a lot of great, heads of yeshivas and whatever, they also had rabbinic ordination. But certainly in Europe, anybody who's a rabbi of a town or a of a synagogue, usually they had rabbinic ordination, right? And that's why they got it, right? Essentially, that's why they got it. So at least they have that title. But again, for practical purposes, again, it's going to depend on the person also. But most people have rabbinic ordination, they're never going to use it. Probably not going to use it. And even if they do, right, even if they do, there are different levels of it also, right? But just because the person has it, what's the most important thing besides passing the exam, right? So my Rabbi would say, you have rabbinic scholars that become, let's say, rabbinic court judges. Now, how do they determine who's a rabbinic court judge? You pass the exam. Now, it's a rigorous exam. people study these laws for like years, something I never did because I don't want to dedicate 10 years just to learning, all these different topics, but not learning other things, right? You really, had to give over a lot to be able to do it because a tremendous amount of information. A tremendous amount of information. Yeah. So in either case, my Rabbi would say, okay, how are they going to determine somebody who is fit to be a rabbinic court judge? Now, what will some people do? Or I shouldn't say some people, he'll say a lot of people. What does a lot of people do? Right? What do? They only want to see if they pass the exam. Right? Now, let's say you have to get, I don't know, you have to get, let's say 70%. Yeah. And they got 75%. They passed. Right? Or they got an 80% or whatever. They're not going to look, go back in the archives and see, what their grade was. Right? They passed. Right? Bottom line is they passed. So what's the criteria for hiring someone? The Rabbi would say that has to be determined by great rabbis of generation. But even more important of the knowledge, that is important. No question, you have to have the knowledge. The question is, do they have fear of heaven? Who do they learn under? Yeah, they go for them, who's their das Torah, who's their rabbinic authority they go to? Right? There are other factors involved besides being book smart. Yeah, you can be book smart, but at the same time, knowing what it says and answering the question are two totally different things, right? Because you have to utilize the information, and it's not always black and white. That's why two people, let's say just on this topic, two people that can ask the same question could get two totally different answers, right? And it could be the answer is really the same, but they're coming from two different perspectives, and for one person, it's going to be too hard for them, different things. So maybe give them a more lenient answer. For someone else, maybe give them a more stringent answer, right? It depends. I mean, there are plenty of things that are black and white. Like you can't get around. Like there's no way. People say, oh, if there's a halachic way, we'll get around it. Not true. There are some things you can't get around. Some things that are just totally forbidden. That's it, right? There is no way. The Torah's not silly putty, right, so to speak. So, you have to be able to see the entire situation. Some things are black and white. That's not a question. What's blessing over this? Blessing over water. Shackle. Very good. That's black and white. Well, then someone says, what if I'm only drinking the water, take medicine? Then you don't make a blessing on it. Right? So whatever. But let's say it's a more complicated thing. The family issue. And family harmony is important, right? Now the question is something permitted? Can you permit it in such a case? Can you not permit it? It depends on a lot of things. It depends on a lot of different factors. It's not just, well, I know this to be forbidden. We all know it to be forbidden. Okay. So since we all know it's forbidden, very good. Right? We know it's forbidden. Yeah, the question is, even though we know it's forbidden, are there any leniencies potentially we could rely on for the sake of family peace? Now, maybe there are. Maybe some leniencies you would never rely on in general, but in such a situation, maybe you could rely on, or maybe not. Depends, right? Not everything's necessarily, black and white, but at the same time, more important than anything else, we spoke the other day about, someone doing, outreach, doing Jewish outreach, kiruv as we would call it, right? We say, what's the most important thing? It's not the knowledge, per se, right? What's the most important thing? You have someone to go to ask your questions. That's the most important thing. The knowledge, okay, you need to get knowledge, very good, right? But you need someone to be able to answer questions. There are things you can't answer on your own, or you shouldn't answer on your own, and you have to know that you're big enough to know when it's beyond your pay grade or not. When you shouldn't do it. And there's a problem. A person, let's say, is in the middle of nowhere. No one's watching them. No one's on top of them. So they can think. They can do what they want. right? And they can rely on things like, you should never rely on this. And I can tell you, I saw it firsthand. If there's no one standing over you, you're in the, al fin do mundo, you're at the end of the world, somewhere. Like I was in South America at the time, in Chile, yeah. There are people relying on things. Nobody should rely on. Yeah, no one's watching them. They call their own shots. They have their own rabbinic authority. They do what they wanted. Right? It's like a junta, as we would call it. It's like a mafia, a different way. They do what they want, and you can't say anything against them. Right? Which got me into trouble. Right? But nonetheless, this is the problem. Right? This is exactly the problem. You can't, you can't rely on things that you can't rely on. Yeah, even in a pinch, there are things that you just can't do. Right? I'll give one example how far this goes. Right? Some people think wrongly, right? Again, I'll answer this question in a second. I pretty much answered it, but the question is, some people think that doing Jewish outreach, I can do whatever I want. In other words, for the sake of kiruv, everything's permissible, right? I'll tell you how far it goes. So there was a story, there were guys learning yeshiva, and they come back for Purim. They come back for Purim Passover. So somebody's doing kiruv. So what does he do? So after hearing the Megillah, hearing the book of Esther, and after the fast, what do? They rent out a disco. Yeah, whatever, a pub, a disco, whatever it was. So whatever, at a whole party, that whole thing, Purim thing, whatever it was, right? Kiruv thing. Okay. Yeah, obviously, men, women together. There's alcohol there, right? As well, I'm pretty sure, as the story goes. So, what does this person do? What does this person want? So you got men and women there, not necessarily a good mixture. Okay, no pun intended. You got men and women there. So what does this bozo do? Or what does he try and do? He's got these guys been learning yeshiva for the last 6 months. Like learning day in, day out. Getting stronger in the Judaism, whatever. He says, why don't you guys come down? It's like as a group, like a whole bunch of guys, come down and strengthen, like make it more frum. make the whole thing like a more, religious atmosphere, so to speak. You're in a pub or a disco, for goodness sakes. You're going to take a yeshiva guy and say that's where it should be? Yeah. Because you want to strengthen the situation? It's for the sake of kiruv. What's the problem? For the sake of outreach. Stick them in a disco? Really? And one of the rabbis said, he heard that he flipped his lid. Totally flipped his lid. And he's like, who told you could do that? Forget about having the party. The party is a different issue. Yeah, you want to do that for the sake of kiruv? Okay, you can say, for the sake of doing outreach. You have a mixture there of people and different things. Okay, I don't necessarily have such an issue, big issue with it. Wouldn't bother me so much. But you don't want yeshiva guys there. They shouldn't be there. Period. So his rabbi tells him, he says, you tell me which rabbi said it. If the rabbi of this institution said it, and you get it in writing, I'll plaster on the front door of my synagogue. I'll make it big as you can't imagine. I'll plaster it all over the front door of my synagogue. He blasted him. Like he should be blasted. Yeah, idiot. You want to, I'd say why I wanted to do it. Why I wanted to encourage yeshiva guys to go there. You think that's where yeshiva guys should be? Bad enough. Let's say here you get, yeshiva guys hanging out with girls. Let's say Thursday night. That should be the worst thing that goes on. And downtown Jerusalem. It's like a big hangout. Okay. So it depends where they're holding. If someone was like trying to hold somewhere in the world, that's not where they should be. Period. And even these other guys shouldn't really be there, but they can't stop it. That is a big thing, and it goes on. It's gone on for years. You're talking about more modern type of crowd, whatever it is. Oh, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. right? But someone who's holding somewhere in the world, spiritually, yeah, they're not somewhere they should be. It's not a good thing. Period. It's not a good thing. Yeah, so you want to encourage that? You as a rabbi of a synagogue, that's the point. You as a rabbi of a synagogue, you want to encourage, guys have been learning for the last 6 months, like very strong or whatever. You want to encourage them to be part of this? Go be part of a disco? Seriously? Because Rabbi blasted him. And he should have blasted him. Not everything's permissible for Kiru, bottom line. Bottom line. Now, back to this question. Can a non-Jew serve as a rabbi? Well, it's kind of an oxymoron. But if they have knowledge, can they give over knowledge to non-Jews? Yes. I don't think they're going to be able to give over knowledge to Jews, right? I think it's certainly Jews that know something, right? But, could they give over knowledge? Could they teach secular Jews if they know what they're doing? In theory, if they would know what they were doing. Yeah. That's one of the things, training Noahites to be able to teach in their own communities, right? We're not making them rabbis by any stretch, but they have to, first of all, they have to go through the material properly, and then they have to, they have to be in contact, obviously, with someone's mother when they have questions or what to do. But if they have the knowledge, yeah, they can teach other non-Jews. Very good, right? Not going to teach Jews, right? But again, technically speaking, just to answer the question fully, technically speaking, rabbi just means a teacher. Could a non-Jew be a teacher if they have the knowledge? Why not? They could. Yeah. Obviously, it has to come from the right perspective. But if it would come from the right perspective, very good. Right? So why not? Now, if you're telling me, could they answer questions about kashrus and Shabbos? No. Definitely not. They should be learning that. Right? And certainly, if they would learn it in depth, like a Jew would, in order to get rabbinic ordination, that'd be totally forbidden. 100% forbidden. Right? They have to learn, a non-Jew has to learn what they need to know. Right? Yeah, what they need to know. But at the same time, it's not going to be in depth as what a Jew would do. Right? They have to know bottom line, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. But they're not going back, and going in depth, the Gemara and the early commentators, later commentators, and all that. There's a limit what they can do. It's a limit. I heard the name of a great rabbi. I don't know if it's true because I never saw it in print. So I'm not going to mention him by name. But, there are certain places, in the Talmud, certain tractates that would apply to a non-Jew. That would apply to a non-Jew. Right? So you can say, so let them learn it. Let them learn it, let's say, superficially, but not as in depth. Could they learn it? According to one, he's a quantified, Torah giant, is not going to mention by name, because I never saw it in print. I never heard him say it, or heard it, or saw it in print. Either way, right? Either way, could they learn it? Just in a superficial way, but to get to what the law is, maybe in theory. Maybe in theory. I never asked my Rabbi about it, but I guarantee. If I would ask him, can a non-Jew learn this? This part of the topic, can they learn these few pages or this or that? You're gonna tell me unequivocally no. Right? That I know for sure. He's never gonna say they should do it. Because what's the fear? Fear is, first of all, they're not gonna understand it. That's one thing, and then they're gonna misinterpret it. Right? That's for sure, because Talmud has to be taught, cannot be learned by somebody on their own, which has nothing to do with knowledge, with IQ, let's say. It has more to do with that. I think I mentioned this before, that you can read the words, you can understand the words. No one said you can't understand what it says in your language, right? Because the Talmud's been translated in many different languages, right? Even Korean when it spoke about it, right? So it can be translated. You can understand. You can read the translation, but still have no idea what it's talking about. Yeah, and again, that has nothing to do with IQ. They're brilliant people. I told the story, whatever, a few days ago. Told this story. Someone's like, Person had, let's just say genius IQ or close, very, very bright. It didn't go. He sat for a long time trying to understand and, went to class every day and this and that. It didn't go. Right? So it has nothing to do with intelligence. Right? It has to do with that spark of the soul of a Jew. Right? But it's complicated. It's, first you have to, Art Scroll made it very easy. So you don't have to know what the words mean, right? You just read the translation. Okay, but you have to understand what it says. What is it saying? Yeah. Then you have three different rabbis argue. Very good. What are they arguing about? What's the whole argument about? Why is one saying like this and one saying, I'm just learning something now, about something about Hanukkah. Yeah, difference of opinion where you like according to different commentaries. But you have to see why did one commentary say like this and not like this? Wasn't the other one forewarning that? Whatever. It's complex, but it's very clear. It's very clear it cannot be learned on its own. Right? You need someone to teach you. Now again, teaching somebody doesn't mean that they can't read it themselves. They can read it themselves. They can even read the footnotes and see, bring down what some of the commentaries say or whatever, or explain a little more in depth, whatever it may be. Okay, right? They can read it. Everyone can read it. That's not a problem. Understanding it's a totally different thing, right? So at the end of the day, a non-Jew is not going to be a rabbi. That's for sure, right? Because the knowledge is going to be very different. But not only that, I mean, in theory, could they teach? Yeah, they can teach if they know they know what they're doing. But we're not going to have status of a rabbi, no question. Because again, that's something very, very specific in what they would get ordination, in, on. And that all these things will be forbidden for a non-Jew. Forbidden, to learn it in depth. No question. Yeah, no question. So what do you do about this guy Danby, who was a Christian scholar, let's say. Christian scholar translated the Mishnah. Yeah, okay. He can commentary on it. Yeah. Yeah. I like to look at it now. What he says. But it's only translation. Right? A translation. But if he would be giving commentary, yeah, that would be interesting to see, because how in the world is he going to know what it means? And I see this all the time. All the time. And it's a scary thing in a certain way. Because people will quote things. They'll see it in their language, and then they'll give their spin on it. And they'll say, but this is what it means. When the reality is that's not what it means. And they're looking at it from a totally different perspective. Well, they say, but this is what it says. Okay, I can also read it. Right? I'll give one example. Someone sent me a video, whatever, a number of years ago, and someone made a comment. Someone who's not converting, right? At least not the moment. At least not that I know of. But the person made a video on, whatever he's quoting halacha. So I'm gonna say, anyone's gonna make a video, whatever the material is, especially about Jewish law, know what you're talking about. Know the ins and outs of what you're talking about. So he made a statement. He quoted what the Shulchan Aruch says. Yeah, what the Code of Jewish Law says. And he says, based on this, the whole thing, it says, I'll just tell you what it says, that it says that women, married or not, have to cover their hair. Jewish women. Yeah, that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Now, so the person shows me this video, shows me whatever. So I saw the video, what he quoted. Now again, I can read it just as good as anyone else can in any language. Okay. Did he quote it right? He quoted it right. I looked it up. He quoted it right. Okay. Now this person, can't read Hebrew. So he doesn't know what the context of this statement is. Now, the commentaries on the side of the Shulchan Aruch and the Code of Jewish Law make it very clear what the context is. Now, but what would my obvious question be? My obvious question would be, he's saying, and again, this is what the Shulchan Aruch says, but it has to be clarified what the context is. And the context is very important, because According to the Shulchan Aruch says women in general, whether they're married or not, have to cover their hair. Okay, very good. Now, if anyone's ever lived, now this is very clear, this person's never lived amongst Jews, because otherwise they would know this statement has to have clarification, has to be clarified. Why? Because if you go to any Jewish community, any Orthodox Jewish community, whether it's modern Orthodox, Chabad, Hasidish, ultra-Orthodox, you never see non-married women cover their hair. Not even when they're in synagogue. Right? In the conservative movements, in some places, not all places, women will come in, let's say, married women, they'll come in, or even not, could be non-married also, doesn't really matter. They have a doily. You know what a doily is? Anyone ever hear of a doily? Right? It's like the satin thing that's got holes in it they put on their head. Kind of like a yarmulke in a certain way, but, more dainty for women. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't cover their hair. That's not what it does. They want to imitate men, so instead of wearing a yarmulke, they'll put this thing on. Now, again, not all places wear it, but it doesn't matter. It's not a head covering. It's not covering your hair in that sense. We're talking about covering your hair, it means you cover all your hair, not just part of it. Not like wearing a baseball cap and the rest of your hair is hanging out. If some of your hair came out, that's a different issue. Right? That's a different issue. Right? But, when it says that the hair has to be covered, it means, for a woman, it means all the hair covered. Now, that being said, how do I know this person, this person, they quoted it right. I'll give them credit. They read it English, good. They quoted it right, very good. Because they wanted to give over this halakha. I don't know, they saw it, whatever, I don't know what they're going through, whatever it was. But when you hear that statement, alarm bells should go off. If a person knows anything, alarm bells should go off. Why? Because in any Orthodox synagogue, you never see non-married women covering their hair. Now, there's a question of who got divorced, whether she has to cover her hair or not. In the other Orthodox community, they cover their hair anyway, even if they're divorced. One Orthodox, they don't. Right? Whatever. Now, I can understand a place like Yemen, where young girls might cover their hair so they get raped. Yeah, so that they look like married women. Okay, so then the locals won't pounce on them. Won't do anything to them. That I can hear. But in any other context, I mean, again, specific context here. Because I looked it up, it was very clear what I was talking about. Right? But the person will make the statements. Anybody can make the statement and say, this is what the Machaber says. This is what the Shulchan Aruch says. This is what the Code of Jewish Law says. Very good. That's what it says. Now, before you look at any of the commentaries, you have to ask the question, what's the case? What's he talking about? It can't be a general case because it never happens. That is not what the halacha is. We don't hold this way. Right? So either the halacha changed for different reasons, or there's a specific context. Because if you go to any ultra-Orthodox community, wherever it is in the world, doesn't matter, no single woman covers her hair. Not any community I've ever been in. Modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, no single woman covers her hair. Let's repeat that. No single woman covers her hair. So if anyone's going to make a video about Jewish law, do me a favor, understand the context, understand what you're talking about, and then give it over. I understand. Yeah, I want to teach people halacha, very good. And he's got all these great English books, very good. I can take one thing this person says seriously. Not after this. Certainly not. I don't care if he can quote it. One of my rabbis, blessed memory, is a teenager. Some priests, stopped him and said, they wanted to learn a certain tractate. They knew it by heart. They can say it verbatim. But they were parrots. That's all they were, parrots. Why? Because when this rabbi of mine had started asking them questions, okay, Bai said like this, very good. Rabbi said like this, very good. So what are they arguing about? Why don't they agree? What did they mean when they said it? Do they mean like this? They mean like that? Right? Then you go in a little bit, deeper on what the commentary is going to bring out. Very good. They didn't have a clue. They did not have one clue. He told me this personally. He said they wanted to speak to me about it. I sat there for a few minutes and they didn't know anything. They were parrots. All they could do was repeat what it said. They couldn't tell you what it meant. And again, this has nothing to do with IQ. It has zero to do with IQ. A person can be brilliant. They could be a doctor. They could be a physicist. They could be, I don't know, a computer programmer. Who knows what? They could be absolutely brilliant. But if you don't have someone teaching you this, oral law, you won't get it. You will not get it no matter how bright the person is. It happens over and over and over. You go to ChatGPT, go to Rabbi Dr. Google, give you certain answers, but there's so much information out there. If a person's never really learned, like in depth, they're not going to understand what they're talking about and what the reference. Maybe some things they'll understand. Okay. I always say to someone, they ask me a question, like, what's the matter? Google doesn't have an answer. ChatGPT doesn't have an answer. Yeah. Yeah. They are well versed in certain things. Okay. But there's plenty of things they don't know. But again, the Gemara says very clear, right? Let's just make this crystal clear. We said this before. Ain't doima milsa la milsa. You're not allowed to say these two things are comparable unless they are. Unless the rabbis tell you. If they don't tell you, then probably not comparable. Yeah. But you have to learn under someone else. Period. You can't learn oral law by yourself. It's impossible. And it has nothing to do with IQ. We're not putting anybody down over here. Right? It's very clear that if you don't have a teacher, you won't understand it. You won't. Yeah, so that would be that would be my answer. So someone asked, why did you claim Hebrew word for teacher? Messianic? Yeah, one of the problems, by the way, is the person wants to learn Hebrew, right? The person wants to learn Hebrew. There are a lot of people out there teaching Hebrew, and a lot of them, you got to be careful because they're Messianics. That's how they draw people in, by teaching Hebrew. Right? So you got to be careful where that information comes from. Somebody asks, okay, what happened to the Second Temple? It got destroyed. Right? Why did it get destroyed? Because the Gemara says, sinas chinam, right? Unlawful hatred. Right? Unlawful hatred. And, speaking Lashon Hara. Right? Speaking badly against others. Yeah. So that's the answer, right? That's the answer. Someone says, okay, how can we serve God without the Second Temple? What do you mean? There's always prayer. When Second Temple was destroyed, prayer just didn't fill the vacuum. There were prayers being said even when sacrifices were being given, right? So prayer did actually fill the vacuum after the Second Temple. You can't bring sacrifice, right? There's no possible way to bring sacrifice. No sacrificial system today. And even if you wanted to, the Arabs wouldn't let you, or the police would stop you, right? But again, you don't have a temple there, so you can't do it. So you can't go up and sacrifice on Temple Mount anyway. Too many halachic problems and too many political problems, right, to do it. So if we say, as part of the prayers in the morning, you read through the sacrifice as if Gemara says, as if you've given them. They say, well, that's not the ultimate way to serve because you can't give sacrifice. Okay, do we have a choice? We don't have a choice. Right? Temple was destroyed. Since the temple was destroyed, I can serve God through prayer. Right? But it doesn't mean prayer never existed. It's only sacrifices, right? And there was a system that was set up. And the system eventually was codified. Right? That once the temple was destroyed, okay, so you have no choice. You can't bring sacrifices. So prayer fulfilled that, but only until the 8th century. We had the first prayer book. Sajagon, right? Time of Sajagon had the first prayer book. Right? So there was a transition, right? But, to say it was only sacrifice and no prayer, it's not true. It was always prayer, right? Now, how much people said and when they said it, and all that. Okay, some people prayed more, some people prayed less, right? But eventually it all got codified by that time, and there were prayer books, right? So we absolutely can, and we're obligated to serve God regardless of whether there's a second temple or not, right? So now there's a question when the third temple is going to be rebuilt. That's one of the things the Messiah has to do. Are we going to go back to sacrificial system, right? That's kind of a difference of opinion. See, but find out hopefully, whenever that should happen, speedily in our days. Very good, right? But that doesn't mean, that doesn't mean, that it's because we don't have sacrifices. Prayer is relevant. There are very strong opinions. Certainly that prayer is even stronger, it's even greater than sacrifice. Yeah, but it didn't overtake sacrifice. He had sacrifices, right? The other people doing sacrifices, so God, don't want to leave the Jewish people out. So how's it going to sacrifice? We don't, we're reading that book now, the book of Leviticus. We don't have so much connection to sacrifice. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. That's what was done, right? And that's what will be, should be done when the temple's rebuilt. Very good, right? But again, even though there's no temple, in Jerusalem, that does not mean, first of all, you can't do sacrifices. That's true, right? But that doesn't mean, you can't do anything, right? Sacrifices, you still had mitzvahs to do besides bringing the sacrifice. You had sacrifice you had to bring every day. You had sacrifice you had to bring on Shabbos, right? Shabbos did not supersede bringing the sacrifice. You had to bring sacrifice anyway, right? But again, there was prayer. It wasn't just bringing sacrifices, nothing else, right? It's not just that, certainly not, right? So we're obligated to do things even if, even if there isn't a second temple. But again, keep in mind, even though sacrifices were being given, there were many that held that prayer, is more important than sacrifice. But sacrifice had to be given as divine command, right? But you can't do it now. Okay, so since we can't do it, what do? You have prayer. Prayer takes care of that. Somebody asked about demons, right? How can a demon be good? Why not? Well, demon was evil by definition. No, it's not evil by definition. It's a spiritual entity, right? The Gemara says a spiritual entity has similar some characteristics like humans, some characteristics like angels, right? The Gemara says very clearly in a number of places, demons cause havoc. They cause damage. Gemara brings down where some of them hang out and whatever, but, rabbis definitely warned against it because they cause damage. They were prone to cause damage. Yeah, so you stay away from them. You stay away from them. Today, it's an irrelevant point because we don't come in contact with them. We wouldn't even recognize one, even if there was one, right? Even if there's one right in front of us, right? But their power has been tremendously weakened anyway, according to many. So it doesn't matter. But doesn't mean they're intrinsically evil, right? Angels. You have angels of destruction. Yeah, you had an angel that came and destroyed Sodom. Does that mean this angel of destruction is evil incarnate? Is evil by itself? No. Remember, an angel and a demon is the same thing, right? It's got some characters like an angel, some like a human. But in general, if God puts it out there to cause damage, does that mean it's evil? No, it means that's what it's supposed to do right now. Right? They're not evil incarnate, they're not born evil. Right? Remember, spiritual forces don't have free will. Yeah, and it's impossible that they would have. That's why it doesn't make any sense about a fallen angel by JC, because they totally misinterpret and demolish Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7. God created evil. Very good. It means we have free choice. No such thing, as an angel rebelling. Why? Because angels were created by God, right? God is the ultimate power, right? At the beginning of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz. God created the heaven and the earth, right? Meaning he created everything in the heavens, everything in the earth, and then he put everything there. And then everything appeared. Okay. So if he created everything in the heavens, how can something in the heaven be more powerful than him? Can go against his will. So Ramchal and Derech Hashem and in the way of God makes this very clear. Very, very clear, and no one disagrees here. No one, I mean, okay, it's very much Tita Kabbalah, it doesn't matter. Nobody disagrees over here. Yeah, angels are spiritual entities. Okay. Spiritual entities controlled by God. They're messengers. That's all they are. They're messengers. So since God is in control of them, they have no power of their own. None of these things have power on their own. Therefore, since God is in charge, they cannot rebel, by definition. They're controlled. They're given a message, right? God uses them, let's say. He uses an angel in order to overthrow and destroy Sodom. Okay. After the angel is done, what does he do? He goes back. God sends him to do something else. God could send that angel to help Granny cross the street. I don't know. Save someone from X, Y, or Z. Now you're going to say, in one case, this angel came and he did something, it destroyed Sodom. Thousands of people die. Okay. In this case, he saves people. So is he good or bad? And the answer is neither. Whatever his task is, whatever God wants it to do, he will command to do it, and that angel has to do it. See, this is why the Christians have a big problem with Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7. Because for their outlook, their world outlook, what are they claiming? What does all evil happen from? From the Satan, from the evil inclination, the angel of death, whatever you want to call him. Very good. Very good. But why do they have a problem with this, with Isaiah 45, verse 7? Because Isaiah 45, verse 7, very clearly, according to the Hebrew, they butcher it, mistranslate it, whatever you want to call it. It's very clear God created evil. Now, for them, that's an impossibility. Right? That's why they have to mistranslate it. Why? Because where does evil come from, according to them? Right? Evil comes from the Satan. Right? This idea of a fallen angel. Very good. Then they say, but what about the Nephilim? That's what everyone asks. What about these angels that fell? Okay, so let me ask a question. Right? God puts them in a human body. Right? And he says, you're going to, they say, we're greater than man. If we'd go down to earth, we wouldn't fail. Yeah, we wouldn't fail. We'll keep your will, blah, blah, blah. Okay, God says, I think you're wrong. But I'm going to prove you wrong. He says, okay, fine. So what does he do? He takes them and puts them in human bodies. Now let me ask you, if an angel's in a human body, are they human or are they angels? As much as that angel right now wants to fly and go wherever it wants to go in the universe, it can't. You know why? It's trapped in the body. The body limits it, right? The body limits it. Now, once an angel goes into the body, is it an angel or a human? Or does it have human character traits? You're going to say both. Okay, maybe a little bit of both. Yeah, it's limited. This angel's in a human body becomes much more physical now. Much more attached to the physical world. Right? So that's not an angel failing. That's an angel in the human body failing. Right? If an angel wants to be in this world, it has to be in a body. An angel cannot live in this world without a body. In general. Yeah? Or a soul, let's say better, a soul. An angel should be in a body. Yeah? To be in this world. Now, if an angel's in the body, you have to ask the $1,000,000 question, is it an angel or is it human? Now, it's got a lot of human character traits because the angel's trapped in the body, right? So now, if this angel sins, goes after its eyes, which it normally doesn't have, now it's in a human body, and this angel now sins with the women of the women of the world, right? These Nephilim, failed and went after their eyes. So you're gonna say, see, look, angels make mistakes. Angels can fall. There's only one problem. I mean, it's a much bigger philosophical issue without getting into Kabbalah. The issue is once the angel goes in the body, what is it? If it's got the status of a human, it's got a lot of human character traits, you can't say it's an angel. Because an angel would never have this desire. Yeah, impossible, because it's a spiritual entity. It's not physical. But once you put it in a physical body, something happens. That's the point. Something physical happens to this angel, and therefore, even if it falls, it's not a spiritual entity at this point, right? So that's the answer. But if you look at Isaiah 45 verse 7, what does it say? God created evil. right? Let me just bring it up here. Yeah, what does it say? Let's here we go. What's the translation? 45 verse 7. It says Yotzer or Borei Choshech. We'll just read the words. Oisa Shalom Borei Ra Ani Hashem Oisa Kol Ele. So let's understand. What does it say? It says Yotzer or, I created, the one who created light. Uborei Choshech, and creates darkness, who forms light, let's say, creates darkness, who makes peace, Oise Shalom, makes peace. Now, these are two words right here. Ubore Ra. Bore, we said before, means to create. Right? Rashis Bara. God created, i.e. the heaven and the earth. Bore Ra, 2 words or less. What does Bore Ra mean? Create evil. That's what it says. Ani Hashem oise kol ele. I am the Lord who makes all these. Very clear. Right? Very clear. Yeah. Now, some of the other translations, look at let's say King James over here. What's King James here say? Say all English translations here. I have a little fun here. I form light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. Good. I make peace. The Lord does all these things. That's good. Right? Another translation similar. I make peace and create evil. The one form of light creates darkness, causing peace and creating disaster. Oh, that's not evil. Yeah. I make peace, national well-being, and create physical evil, i.e. create, put in parentheses here, physical evil meaning calamity. Right? Some other definitions, I create doom, create disaster. Yeah, but they don't say create evil. Here's a translation, happiness and sorrow. I mean, this translation is way off, some of them. I bring peace, I cause trouble. It's not evil. Create darkness, one who makes peace and creates disaster. It's the problem. Create calamity. Rob means evil. Yeah, these are fancy ways of saying, okay, creates problems, creates trouble. Okay, so that gets out of the problem. Doesn't say evil. But here it's very clear. It means evil. Right? There are some definitions that say create evil. Right? But the vast majority, disaster, trouble, disaster. Create trouble, calamity, disaster, trouble. All right. You have a few that say evil. You have a few. There are 20 that say disaster, calamity, whatever. And there's like 3 that say evil. It's a problem. That is what it means. That's a strict definition. Yeah. Calamity is not evil. It's like, okay, he creates things, he creates problems in the world. And that's the same thing as saying evil. Certainly not strong, not even questioned. Okay. Is a Lashon Hara, all right, good Lashon Hara question there. Is a Lashon Hara to confide to a friend to express a problem with another person? It's hard to determine what is the benefit, right? A constructive purpose. Yeah. So what would happen if you see a therapist? Let's ask a different question. Could a person who's having difficulty, whatever it is, that they have a problem with the sibling, let's say. They have a problem with the sibling, and, they got messed over in a certain thing. So they go for therapy, and they're about to say what happened. Say it's Lashon Hara, right? But this has a benefit. If the therapist is good, this is a benefit, right? Why is it a benefit? Because they're going to help you. They're going to help you deal with the emotion, right? So speaking Lashon Hara, that's what it's going to be, right? It's for sure going to be Lashon Hara, right? But it's going to benefit. It's going to help the person. Now, if you're confiding to a friend, depends what the constructive purpose is, right? It depends what it is. Yeah. And Lashon Hara is very specific here. It has to be something, it has to be something, if you're saying it over, you have to know firsthand. It has to be firsthand knowledge. There are conditions, right? You can't exaggerate. You have to tell it the way it is. There has to be obviously a constructive purpose, right? So to speak. So is it hard to determine what the benefit is? Yes. If a person, let's say, vents, they vent to someone else, something they're going through. And they say, oh, this person, my spouse, whatever, did this, that, and the other thing. Yeah. Now, that person can't believe them 100%. If it's something that they may have to guard themselves against, whatever, it's okay. The question is, what's constructive purpose here? Right? That's the question. What is considered, what's considered, what's considered constructive over here? Right? That's whatever. It's a loaded question. It depends. Right? It depends. So if you go through, there are seven different criteria, right, of being able to say, Lashon Hara. Let's say someone wants to say it because it's going to make them feel better. That's not constructive. That's not necessarily constructive. It doesn't have a purpose. Can the person help you? Yeah. It has to be something constructive, right? So that's how are we gonna define constructive? So it depends what it is. Right? It depends what it is. In therapy in general would be permitted. Right? Because otherwise, how are they gonna know how to help you if they don't know what the situation is? You may have to say exactly what the situation is. Right? So it depends. That's it's not easy to determine what purpose is. If it's just you're venting and it makes you feel good, that's not a purpose. If it's something they can help you with, let's say it's a parent. Let's say it's a parent, child's having difficulty with their spouse, like serious difficulty. They're allowed to tell the parent, right? Maybe they shouldn't probably go to someone else, but let's say they come to the parent, yeah, and they're giving over the information. Now, they're giving over the information because they think the parent can help them or can guide them, right? And can guide them. So that has a purpose, right? That has a purpose. It's not clear cut. Depends what it's for, right? I will say that people use this like a rag doll, and people will say, oh, this has a benefit. This has a toelis, right? It's got a constructive purpose. Yeah, they'll say it, but it doesn't. They just want to vent. It's not constructive, per se. So, you got to be careful. But people use this permissibility a lot, right? They use it a lot and they never should. Let's say better. They never should, right? They take it way out of context. Oh, this is a benefit. Then when you hear what it is, it's not a benefit. Yeah. So yeah, it's not so easy. Early warning. Yeah. Well, I'm in my sealed room, so there's nowhere else for me to go. And we got one before, but it never came. So, it didn't come here anyway. Yeah, and that, by the way, that's one thing that should not be done is, if there's a siren to run. Most people have gotten hurt by sirens, not everybody. Most people have gotten hurt by sirens have gotten hurt because they were running to a shelter. If you run, you could fall. If you fall, you can get hurt. And there are many, many cases. More people, I think exponentially, have gotten hurt more by running to a shelter than by by debris and getting, and buildings getting hit and all that. Right? In certain places you don't have very much time. Right? When Hamas is sending missiles, across the border, they have 15 seconds. 15 seconds to get somewhere. So that I can understand. The person somewhere hear a siren, like, you try and find somewhere to go. I can understand that. In most places when the missiles come, you got time. At least a minute and a half, so to speak. And not everyone's going to, unfortunately, or not, going somewhere. What if they're in the store? Well, if you're in the store, most likely in the store has a place, right? And what if you're not in the store, right? Stand by a doorway, go in someone's house. I don't know, whatever it is. But running's not the issue. Certainly not the answer. You could easily, most people have got injured by falling. During the whole thing, thousands of missiles. Miraculously almost hit nothing, most of them. Yeah. So yeah, people have got injured. People have gotten hurt by missiles. Very good. Or not so good. More people have gotten hurt running to shelters. And it's ironic. It is ironic, but it is what it is. Yeah. Let me see. Any other questions? See, like this is the most annoying part because you get a warning, then nothing happens. Yeah. Yeah, then nothing happens. But anyway, yeah. Any other questions? So the trip before I could run, yeah. Well, I had to go the other day, yesterday. Yesterday there was a siren and Jerusalem. So the bomb shelter's right next door to where I learned. So, okay, saw someone not running per se, but walking fast. I'm like, I'll get there. I'm not worried. You got at least a minute and a half, easy. Before anything. But it's kind of funny. You see, everyone in the building. You got these kids and whatever. It's like, so I told someone, they said, oh, what happened during the siren? I was selling hot dogs out front, right outside the bomb shop. So whatever. It's like, a joke, but not such joking matter. Anyway, yeah. So we'll see. A number of times we've gotten warnings, but no sirens. So actually, I just heard a bunch of booms earlier, and we didn't even get a siren. It wasn't even a warning, right? It happened, whatever, nearby. I shouldn't say nearby, whatever happened in Jerusalem, I guess, but not here. But anyway, see what happens here. All right, I'm gonna stop here. I do this every Tuesday and Thursday. I apologize starting late, very late, but we had technical issues. So anyone has any questions, find me on Facebook at Michael Kaufman, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Jerusalem, OrthodoxConversion.com, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Jerusalem on YouTube. There I got videos, Q&As, ethics of our fathers, book of Leviticus. Want to send me an email, RabbiChaimKaufman@gmail.com, RBBIChaimCoffman@gmail.com, whichever good. Beginning